Hello, friends. We had a break in the microphone wire, which causes me just to speak but nobody to hear me. Some of you might consider that a grace, but if you were listening, you probably wanted to hear. So the people who live with me all the time sometimes consider laryngitis, which only happens sometimes, the answer to a prayer. But since you all have a choice, I suspect you would like to hear what I have to say. So we are on chapter 3, verse number 4, of the Bhagavad Gita itself, and it's chapter 13 of Swami's commentary. His commentary is many more words than the Gita, of course. And the chapter is called Why Fight? Because the entire conversation, the entire Gita is this conversation between Arjuna and Krishna about why Arjuna needs to engage in this war with his cousins to have control of the kingdom. And the allegory is too obvious, because when we get on the spiritual path and begin to understand that this world is just a play of light and dark, that it's just Maya, and that when we die, it just ceases to exist for us anymore, like, why do we have to be so engaged in it? And it's a really very real question. It's not only a philosophical question, it's a psychological, it's an emotional question. It is really the crux of the matter on the spiritual path, which is, if we are already one with God, and if this world is a dream, why do we have to constantly struggle? There's lots of different answers to it, and that's why the book is so big. But particularly right now, we're dealing with this part about action versus inaction, actionlessness, which is trying to put into English concepts that are probably more exact in Sanskrit. So now, chapter 3, verse number 4 says, actionlessness, I think actionlessness would be it's the reverse of stillness. It's the opposite way of saying complete stillness. Actionlessness would be complete stillness. Actionlessness cannot be attained by mere inaction. So therefore, we're thinking of actionlessness and inaction as the opposites. But what we're really talking about, I presume, is stillness. Stillness cannot be attained merely by not acting. And that's what we'll talk about more. One who forsakes work in the name of divine aloofness from activity cannot reach perfection. So we're going to go over this for several verses. And Swami in his commentary says, it is to set an example for their disciples that fully liberated masters who return to the world as avatars engage themselves in various spiritually uplifting activities, sometimes even participate in world-emancipating tasks. He uses Krishna as an example, and of course Master himself also participated in the world very fully. So let's sort of deal with this for a minute. There's lots of different elements to this. Actionlessness cannot be attained by merely inaction. Inaction meaning, in one word, non-action. Those who refrain from work do not attain perfection. I'm trying to deal just with this verse instead of the ones that also come after it. It comes back to, I remember when I was first learning about the spiritual path, and that was I was 19 and I was 20, and I was associated. I was living in Palo Alto. First I was living in Los Angeles. Later I was living in Palo Alto again. I have a certain geographic karma with this area, and we were a group. It was mostly men. There were a couple of other women in it, but it was mostly men who were very strong-minded. I think it was relevant that they were mostly men because they had a certain intellectual impracticality that is not always characteristic of the male, of the masculine energy, but it can be. And they would intellectualize a great deal about why would you bother to participate in the world. And it's all very convincing if you just talk about it, because you lay out these Vedantic principles, and then you lay out all the work and effort and energy, and you just think, what is the point? If there's nothing at the end of it, what is the point? But then that so-called philosophical point, I would say that logical conundrum that the Vedanta philosophy can create in your mind, is contradicted by the examples of the saints, and really contradicted by the example of the avatars especially. Now Krishna is an avatar, and this is the Bhagavad Gita. An avatar is a fully self-realized being who incarnates on earth only to bring enlightenment. The distinction between an avatar and everyone else who is here is that the rest of us are here because we are compelled by some remaining karma. Even a jivan mukta, whose consciousness is God realized, there's, as we were talking about it in an earlier session here, there's a little bit of something that causes them to keep coming back. All of this is so far beyond my actual realization that I like to back up from it as soon as I've just said it out loud. But the point is, the masters live very, very active lives. Paramhansa Yogananda was, he came to his guru as a very young man. His guru sent him out to do work, and he founded a school for boys in India, and it became extremely successful. Then in the midst of all that success, he was called by a vision to come to the West, and he came to the West on a boat in 1920, almost 100 years ago now. And from the moment he landed, he was meeting people and giving lectures and teaching, and then he went on spiritual campaigns back and forth across the United States, speaking in all these enormous halls and initiating thousands of people by the end into Kriya. He bought property in Los Angeles. He struggled to make that a success. He faced betrayal. He had lawsuits, and he never stopped. And you would think, if this world is a dream, why did he bother? More recently in time, we have Swami Kriyananda, who, in the 45 years that I lived near him, but it would be 48 years. No, he died in 2013. The 45 years that I knew him, I never saw a human being work as hard as he did. He never let up. That's the only word I can use. It's not that he never sat down for an afternoon and read a novel, because he did, or it's not that he never took a holiday, because he did, but he never let up. Not for a moment, really. His consciousness and his energy was always pressing forward, and prodigious amount of work in terms of music and books and communities and lectures and ideas and on and on and on. I have published now my biography of him called Swami Kriyananda Lightbearer. It's now available in audio and ebook from Amazon or from my website, Asha Joy. And the paper book is in America, in California, almost ready to be shipped. Within 5 days it'll be shipped, so you can order that too. But it's a chronicle year by year of what he did, and if I hadn't lived through it, I wouldn't have believed it. Now, why on earth would such a person of such realization work so hard? Because when it's over, what does it matter? But perfection is transcending all the compulsive energies that drive us. And once we've transcended the compulsive energies that drive us, then we can just be a pure instrument for the Spirit. And the Spirit is overflowing with love for humanity. The Spirit is love for humanity. The Spirit is love. God Himself, Divine Mother, are pure compassion. And when pure compassion looks at human suffering, it does not yawn with indifference. It becomes powerfully motivated to alleviate that suffering, to bring love, to bring comfort. And it doesn't look away with indifference. And so the way that the masters manifest themselves, they're manifesting what love, what bliss looks like. When Swamiji has been asked, as people are often asked, why did God manifest creation? Like, what was the whole point of the whole thing? And among the many interesting answers I've heard, I think the best really is the one that Swami Kriyananda gave. He said, it is the nature of joy, the nature of bliss, to want to share itself. Now, what I love about Swamiji's, cryptic, perfect little epigrams of truth, if epigram is the right word, is that he had a way of making this the top of the mountain conclusion and then showing you the route up. And it was so simple. He said, if you go out to dinner tonight and you discover a restaurant that's really good, that you've never been to before and that none of your friends know about, like, what do you do as soon as you go home? Well, nowadays, you would use your little phone and you would take a picture of your dinner and you would send it out to everyone you knew. And probably before you even finished your dessert, half your friends would be in the restaurant with you. But you used to go home and call your friends, or even more old-fashioned, you would send an email saying, I've just found the most terrific place. Because somehow if you're enjoying it more if you tell people. You go to a play that you like, you read a book that you like. It's the nature of joy to want to share itself. So once you sort of understand a kind of impulse and principle, you can just keep elevating that. At what point does it stop applying? So Swamiji speaks of the bliss of the infinite, Sat Chidananda, ever new, ever conscious, ever new, everlasting bliss. He said it's just the nature of bliss to want to share itself. So once again, I'm beyond my portfolio in actually speaking about it, but the poetry of it is very elevating. So God wants everyone to experience his bliss, and God and the elevated soul who is in tune with God, whether he's fully self-realized or merely has his nose above water, you see other people suffering and you think this will help. I mean, isn't that what people are doing all the time? This is so delicious, this chair is good for your back, this yoga course is, good for your soul, this book will be entertaining to you. We see that other people's joy could be improved, and if we have an idea of how it could be improved, we tell them about it. And the more dynamic our own joy, the more one finds this just overwhelming desire to share it. It's very interesting to think about Swami Kriyananda's life. Well, I've spent all my life thinking about his life, and a few of the years recently really thinking about his life, writing this book. And so many aspects of his character, which are illustrative of the principles, have become obvious to me. When we were engaged in 12 years of litigation, when Self-Realization Fellowship felt that they had a monopolistic right to Master's teachings and tried to enforce that self-proclaimed monopoly through the courts, the whole kerfuffle escalated into an attempt to destroy the reputation of Ananda and Swami through a entirely bogus, although nonetheless successful, charges of sexual harassment against Ananda and Swami and all of us, really, against the whole ball of wax. Was accused of being everything that a cult might be in your biggest nightmare. Part of the reason that in the end we actually didn't prevail in the jury case, for 100 reasons, which you can read about in my new book, Swami Kriyananda Lightbearer, is because it was so preposterous we never took it seriously. And we just didn't know. In the SRF lawsuit, we had a very good judge in federal court. And we really didn't know that if you don't have a very good judge, all kinds of things can happen. So anyway, it doesn't matter. We were wrongly judged guilty, but that's not the issue at the point of the story. And the point of the story is, oh yes, in that context, because the whole lawsuit against us was lifted literally from other lawsuits that the same attorneys had filed against other so-called cults, and they really literally had a laundry list of charges, and they just erased the names that had been in there a couple of times before and stuck in our names. But in some places they even forgot. That's one of the reasons we knew what it was. And all of a sudden this is a lawsuit against somebody else. But of course he was accused of dictatorial behavior and dominating everyone with his will and making demands on us like this. And Swami just sort of slightly in bewilderment, but not he was bemused, but not amused. He said, "Have I ever asked any of you to do anything? Have I ever made any demands on you? Have I ever set down any rules of even rules of behavior in this community? What to speak of me personally making demands on you?" And all of us who'd been with him by this time, this is 1994, been with him for more than 20 years. I had to actually think, did he ever actually, tell me to do anything? And the answer was actually no. And I realized as I thought about it, but Swami nonetheless commanded enormous influence, but he led by enthusiasm. And even that's how he put it. Not enthusiasm like that, but he was so enthusiastic about what he was doing. Swamiji just said all he ever did in his life was just do what he felt to do with full and joyous enthusiasm, and the magnetism of that just caused people to fill in behind him. It was in this context that Swami protested against certain, which he said were completely false, characterizations of what Jesus must have been like. Jesus was a man of sorrows, acquainted with woe, I think, is one of the, I believe it may be in Handel's Messiah, and that he was never known to smile. And Swamiji said, no one would follow someone who just walked around weeping all the time. I mean, think about it. If you have some spiritual teacher who just, so-called, who just sits there and weeps for the sins of the world, I mean, you just wouldn't want to be with him or her. It would just be too much of a downer. What the avatars and the saints bring into this world is this joyous enthusiasm in which you're just automatically drawn into it. I mean, that's the picture of who Jesus must have been. I mean, they were risking their lives by the end. And then after he died, they risked their lives in order to stand by him. There had to have been there had to have been an absolutely central component of bliss to that. Not always pleasure, not always ease, but bliss, which is really quite different, a whole other reality. So to understand what spiritual perfection is, we can't just look to words on paper. We have to look to the living examples. And that's why the power of a teaching, the scripture certainly helps. But the power of a teaching in the Indian tradition, in the traditional Indian way, the institutions are either non-existent, incidental, or held at arm's length. Because nobody believes that you can take the consciousness of a master and solidify it into a group of rules and then say, this is what Jesus is. And that's what the Christian churches have done. But the teaching of a master is the consciousness of the master. And in India, they don't bother to organize it, because if a great master has a great disciple, that great disciple will carry the vibration forward. If that great disciple of a great master has a great disciple, then that great disciple will carry it forward. But as soon as there is no living manifested channel for that consciousness, then of its own, the influence will simply shrink. And it won't be lamented, because people can always go directly back to the source, but the source is the experience. And it's only when we get really confused and try to codify it into rules, just like the very nature of that kind of consciousness is, it can't be fixed into form. It just simply can't be. In his book, The New Path, Swami has a chapter called All True Teaching is Individual. And he just talks about Master looked at every soul and helped that soul understand how it was supposed to go forward. And two souls might resemble each other in the way they behave, and God knows the yamas and the niyamas and the 10 Commandments and the Eightfold Path of Patanjali, there's identifiable progressive trends. But even within those, as it speaks here in a verse or two, one has to move with one's own karma. That's the only way you can do it. And it's that living power that we're always looking for. In his book, Revelations of Christ, the whole beginning part of that book it's a very simple question. Who has the right to speak for Jesus? Who has the right to define what Jesus meant? Is it the biggest institution? Is it the richest institution? Is it the scholar with the most degrees? Or is it the one who shares the consciousness of Jesus? And Swami says in the Revelations of Christ, basically, it's the saints who have the right to speak for Jesus because they understand his consciousness. Other people may record his words and interpret his words, but you have to understand his consciousness. So, back to what we're talking about, you cannot achieve the actionless state merely by refraining from action. And those who refuse to participate in the world in the name of it just being a dream, the Gita says really simply, they do not attain perfection. So this is again the middle of a conversation. He's saying to Arjuna, no, actually, Arjuna, if you don't fight, you're really not going to get what you want. It's not going to work for you. I'm sorry, it's not going to work for you. And it also depends, there's another aspect here about action and inaction. It also depends on what path you're on and what the mission of that master is. You know, Swami Kriyananda often said, Paramahansa Yogananda in his, it says here, sometimes indeed avatars participate in world emancipating tasks. And our particular line of gurus, repeatedly through history that we know about, has participated in world emancipating acts. The Babaji himself says, Krishna himself was Babaji. That's what Master said, and Master said he was Arjuna. And the Bhagavad Gita has influenced, the direction of spirituality for millennia. It just goes on and on and on with its influence. Even in Dwapara Yuga, here Master came to teach the Bhagavad Gita again. This whole battle of Kurukshetra through the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita is just, it's been this beam of light that has run through the whole of Indian teaching for centuries and centuries, and now has been carried across to the West. I mean, talk about a world emancipating action, and the carrying across of it to the West. Master was the first Indian master, great Indian master, not to touch American soil, but to dedicate his life to teaching in the West. And Swamiji often, and Master talks about, just coming to such an uncongenial place for an Indian devotee, just such a materialistic country, such a different way of approaching life than what he was used to in India. Master wrote that beautiful poem, My India. My body is hallowed, he said. I am hallowed, he said, because my body touched the sod of India. He spent his life in the West, but his spiritual heart was always in India, and those were the last words he spoke. In Los Angeles, after a lifetime in America, he spoke of the greatness of America, but he died speaking of India. So on an ordinary level, the sacrifice of coming to the West, it was a world emancipating act. And it was, as Swamiji said, Master came to establish a beachhead. It's in the war against delusion, is how you have to think about it. Master was a warrior, and he came into this atmosphere in which what he had to offer was essentially unknown, and he had to establish openness, receptivity, and understanding that was just so completely foreign to the way the West was thinking. That's why his Autobiography of a Yogi, published in 1946, is still a best-selling book in many countries in many languages. It was a world emancipating act, and tremendous energy had to follow it. And Swami Kriyananda came, as he had done in the life when Master was William the Conqueror, as he did when Master was Fernando III in Spain. Swami came as Master's spiritual or physical son, physical in both of those lifetimes, but spiritual in this lifetime since Master was a monk. And, Master finished his part of the battle and then handed in some cases, literally the sword to Swamiji, And if not, in this case, it wasn't the sword, it was the pen and the voice and the idealism. And Swamiji just spent his entire life making it happen because the Master had come to participate in world emancipating activity. And then us, me and us, who came too late for Master's life, but just in time for Swami's, or maybe just past Swami's incarnation, we're just part of this trend. This is why we incarnated. This is our path. This is our Master. And we can't just sit back and say, oh, I prefer not to act. Because it's the nature of this path to participate in world emancipating actions. And it seems that it's been the nature of this path for a really long time. And of course, within that, some are called to a much more contemplative life, some are much less on the front lines. But ours is a path of world emancipating actions. If you're going to be in tune with a particular path, you have to pay attention to what it is. And in fact, when people are choosing or making up their minds about where they belong spiritually, you have to look at the wholeness of that path and see, what part of this can I embrace? Who am I really? What are the people here living like? Do I want to be like them? When Swamiji was the sole definition of what we were doing, did I want to be like him? Creative, dedicated, outgoing, karma yogi, in addition to meditation, contemplation, and kriya. But in addition to, I know when we were working very hard at Ananda, there were people who were devotees of the ideas that I was sort of saying at the beginning when I was with my intellectual friends. Since this world is only a dream, why are we working so hard? And they actually found some writing from Master where he said, we should meditate, we should take quiet walks, we should read, we should study, we should write, and then, do a few hours a day of God-reminding work. And we were doing a lot more than a few hours a day of work, and someone brought that to Swamiji, as if to dispute his interpretation of the path. Swami read it, and he says, oh, that's for a higher age. He said, right now we have a responsibility to establish a beachhead. And, not everyone wants to embrace it as fully as, for example, I have. But it is what they said in front of us. And if we're not going to be outward in our activity, we have to be equally energetic in our activity. I remember many years ago when Swamiji was doing a lot of touring, and he had a lot of us out I say out because we all lived at Ananda Village then. So you were either at home or you were out. And this one woman wrote to Swami and said, I'm all for what you're doing. I don't object, but I don't want to do it myself. She said, I just want to stay home and raise my family and take care of my husband and meditate and help the community. But I don't have any inclination to be a missionary for Master. And Swami wrote back, he said, good for you. He said, I have to go tell everyone about communities, but somebody has to stay home and make one. And it wasn't that she didn't want to participate in the world emancipating work. It was that she knew where she fit into it. And she just wasn't. She was a shy, quiet, with simple tastes and simple interests, quite intelligent, quite capable, quite deep. But it just wasn't her style. But she understood that world emancipating activity was why we came. And so you see, it's not about what you do, it's how you think and how you feel about it. And it would be wrong for me or anyone to persuade you that you must always be outwardly active in order to be on this path. Of course you don't. But you have to be receptive and attuned to the example our Master set, so that whatever aspect of their teaching one embraces, one is doing it out of attunement and not out of rebellion or resistance. And that's the important point. Some of those people who were part of my first intellectual circles, even though they had the opportunity, some of them, to be part of Ananda or to be inspired by Swami Kriyananda, they weren't, because the world emancipating acts did not inspire them. Their concept of the path was simply different. So not everybody has to do this. But if you're going to do this, one should consider doing it with one's whole heart. So, number 3, 5. No one can remain actionless
for even a moment. All are compelled by nature, whether willingly or unwillingly, to be active, driven by the gunas, the three qualities of nature. 3.6. The person who restrains his organs of action, but in whose mind rotate the thought of sense objects, is rightly regarded as a hypocrite and is self-deluded. Well, Krishna doesn't mince words, does he? He doesn't give you any equivocal space on that one. So, what he's talking about, this is philosophically very subtle, because creation itself is a vibration. It's like to be in creation, the way it's expressed, so that we can have some understanding of it. From the stillness of spirit, spirit begins to vibrate, and that's why everything is dual. In the Christian Bible, it says, "In the beginning was the Word," and in the Old Testament, it says, "Let there be light," so that there's nothing and then there's something. Light being a wave of energy, the Word being a wave of sound. That there is stillness, and then there's action. Light itself is an action, it's a movement. So as long as we are in creation, we can't be absolutely still, because there will always be a vibration. It's only when we exit from creation altogether to merge back into spirit, which is the perfection we're trying to reach. He said we're compelled, willingly or unwillingly. We are driven by the gunas. We breathe, our heart beats, the blood circulates, and thoughts accumulate. The vrittis spin. Karma is held by all the magnetic energy that's happening. Our chakras are not still. And merely to just not do anything outward does not, this is what they're saying repeatedly, does not actually make us still, because all of this is still going on. Then Krishna takes it a step further. The person who restrains his organs of action, holds back his hands and his thoughts and his actions in that respect, but whose mind still rotates around the sense objects. And sense objects isn't just sensual objects with desire, but just the facts of this world. Merely because we're not doing anything doesn't mean we're not doing anything, because thought itself just keeps this vibration going. So he says is rightly regarded as a hypocrite and is self-deluded. And what he means by that is you can't just sit there and overcome the ego. You can't just sit there and say, I won't be myself, because the very thought that I won't be myself reinforces the thought that you are yourself. Now, this doesn't even make sense to some of us, but I have known serious sadhakas who really attempt to overcome the ego just by declaring that they're going to do it. But he says, if your thoughts are still rotating, you're deluding yourself. You're not really doing those things which will actually liberate you. What earlier in the Gita, or later, I'm not sure where the verse is, Krishna says to Arjuna that you should be a yogi. And in the commentary on that verse, which may be in this book or in a different one, Swamiji makes the comment that what the practice of yoga is that it starts with who and what you are. Yes, we had this earlier in these webinars. It starts with who and what you are and works with it. So what Krishna's trying to explain to Arjuna here is merely because you think you don't want to participate in this war, you think you can just sit it out. You can't really just sit it out, because you won't actually be still. You'll just be not doing this. And not doing it is an action, because it is still there. You haven't transcended it, you're just refusing to engage in it. And that itself is a commitment of energy. And that commitment of energy prevents you from coming back into pure actionlessness, which is pure stillness. Elsewhere in what he says in here is, let's see, anyone who tries to be inactive becomes merely lazy. I mean, that's a pretty flat statement. Anyone who pretends to be disinvolved in the world around him is being merely a hypocrite. I mean, that's a very strong statement. And self-deluded, what is the word that Krishna uses, and what he means by that is you're deluding yourself to think that you're actually practicing sadhana merely because, by not being involved. Now, there's a point at which action falls away on its own. And a person like Ram Gopal Muzumdar, who's described in Autobiography of a Yogi, meditation becomes the only work. And Swami talks about Swami Rama, who he met in India, who was a very advanced disciple of Ramana Maharshi. And he just lived very quietly and mostly meditated. He didn't have a missionary work. He had very few disciples. But work had fallen away from him. When Master met Rajarsi Janakananda, who was then James J. Lynn, and he lived in St. Louis, and for a time, Master had him run a meditation group. But then Master told him not to do it anymore. He said, close the center, that's not for you. Now you would think he was such a saint, why wouldn't Master want him to do this? But he simply didn't need to do that kind of action anymore. He was able to just meditate because he could create actionlessness now by refraining from outward action, because he was at the point where he could also refrain from inward action. His thoughts were no longer circling around the world perceived by the senses. You see the difference? But they didn't philosophically come to that point. They didn't reason their way to it. It just simply was who they were. That there was no longer any impetus for outward action. It wasn't a matter of restraining oneself. It simply, the vibration simply wasn't there anymore. So when Master says self-deluded, he doesn't just mean delusional, he means you're kidding yourself. You've persuaded yourself that you're doing something, like Arjuna is persuading himself that he shouldn't do this battle. But Krishna's saying to him, that's a delusion. You've talked yourself into it, but it's actually hypocritical. It sounds good intellectually, but it's not really who you are. And your desire to do it is motivated by other than noble sentiments. Elsewhere in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says something to the effect of Arjuna, that you're using the words of the philosophers to justify the attitudes of a fool. And that's what he means by self-deluded. You're playing games with yourself with these words. It's not really true. And so, in the commentary it says, in order to achieve the actionless state, it is utterly necessary to act consciously, not merely driven by nature, but deliberately and intelligently. He said, like a surfer going with the waves. So what we have to do to transcend the compelling nature, the compelling nature of nature, the compelling forces of the vibratory world, the gunas, the impetus that is always making us restlessly engage with the world, even if we're sitting perfectly still, if the energy is just inside of us. He said you have to act consciously and intelligently first, and that's how you transcend it. You don't transcend it by just sitting there and hoping it'll go away. And that's why the masters are so tremendously active. And in the commentary on Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, Swami just has this sentence, just as simple as it can be. The best way to overcome the ego is by selfless service. Because then we're not lazy. We're working hard against the compelling forces of nature which draw us back towards self-concern, and acting consciously and intelligently to take that energy and direct it in a higher way. To do God-reminding, God-inspired, uplifting things, even world-emancipating actions. Because that's how we free ourselves. Yes, we do a lot of good for the world, but the greatest good we do is we gradually emancipate ourselves from the compelling forces of ego. And the more we emancipate ourselves from that, the more beneficial we are to mankind. And even more confusing, more profound in its implications. By confusing, I mean just powerfully demanding of us, is in the Festival of Light. There's 4 stages of spiritual growth in the soul's long journey. First is the mission, where God has a plan for us, but then we get confused, and we think that God's plan is really not so good, that this selflessness stuff doesn't feel as good as the selfish stuff feels. The little bird in flight for the first time gloried in his newfound strength. He began to think, how foolish I would be to share my strength with anyone. What is wisdom if not to keep what is mine for myself? And this is how you see it in little children. They don't enjoy, many of them don't enjoy sharing. They just want it for themselves. Children can be so adorable and so naked in their ego at the same time. There was this little girl, she was, I don't know, 2, maybe, sitting on her parents' lap, and she's singing, because she's been hearing these chants, Lord, I am thine, I am thine, I am thine. And then she saw her bottle coming toward her, and she changed her song to, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine. Same melody. She just grabbed it and held it. And ever since then, I've always sung, sometimes just for fun, Lord, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine. And that's what happens. So you enter the second stage, which is the revolt. Which is, no, I think the selflessness stuff is really not right. I feel better the more I have. So we rebel against our mission, our divinely inspired mission. We get caught up in ego. And then we crash and burn. And the little bird persists, even though repeatedly he lost everything he had. And then after a while it gets to be too much for him. And he begins to ask questions. And he begins to wonder, like, am I right? What is really true? It shifts. And then you shift from, God, why are you doing this to me? To, God, why are you doing this to me? And then we come to the third stage, which is the quest, where we become a truth seeker, where we really want to know the truth. And that's where most of us are. We really want to know the truth. Sometimes we still fall into revolt, but we really want to know the truth, so we keep trying. But then there's the fourth and last stage. Greater can no love be than this, from a life of infinite joy and freedom in God, willingly to embrace limitation, pain, and suffering for the salvation of mankind. Such ever has been the sacrifice of the great masters for the world. Here then is the fourth and last stage of the soul's long journey. Now, I offer the festival at Sunday service many, many Sundays out of the year, and have been doing this ever since we started, which is like 30 years. So it's a lot of times that I've read those words, and every time I read those words, I think to myself, wow, the fourth and last stage, willingly to sacrifice infinite joy and freedom for the salvation of others, that's the world emancipating act. That's really understanding that in order to achieve perfection, or even once we have achieved perfection, that perfection is the perfection also of compassion and care for others, so that willingly certain souls, and I do not understand this, just come back again and again to show us how we're supposed to do it. And what they show us is a life of great determination to do God-reminding things, to do ego-dissolving things. Sometimes when people ask, like, what is the consciousness of an avatar? Well, the first thing is, how would I know? Swami says, whatever his role on earth, speaking of an avatar, he never loses his inner awareness of freedom. I don't exactly know what that would feel like, but it's beautiful to hear. But this is the way I've had several images that kind of explain what an avatar is. And sometimes you can explain it in contrast to us. Just for the sake of the discussion, imagine that there's this sort of a brick wall here that's very high that you can't see over, and we're all in the astral world. The astral world is beautiful, and we're having a wonderful time over here. But then this restlessness sets in, and some karmic inclination that cannot be satisfied in the astral world, suddenly it sort of comes due, and we find ourselves in the womb. And how consciously we enter that womb, I really don't know, and I'm sure it depends. But in the same way, and I'll just think of it like this, if you're home in the evening and you have it all set up and the candles are lit and the incense is burning and you're just all set, you're just going to have this long meditation, and it's just going to be so beautiful, and they'll have the whole evening in front of you. But just before you meditate, you check your phone to see if there's any messages. And, oh my God, on WhatsApp, so-and-so is in town, and all my old friends are gathering, and they're at this restaurant, and pretty soon you've changed your clothes, you're out, you're sitting at the table with them, you're laughing, and finally you come home, and oh my, the candles are still burning, and the incense is still on. You don't even really remember when you made the decision to do something else, but the impulse took over you. And I think that's this is my version of what happens in the astral world. Everything is really happening, and then something catches our eye. Somebody we're really attached to is going to be born. Some mother that we've always wanted to have is about to conceive. Just some country we've always wanted to live in. Some castle that we used to see when we were a child in another lifetime. Just something catches our eyes, and bingo, we're in somebody's womb. And there we are, and we're doing it again. And then when we're born, now we're on the other side of this brick wall, and spiritual freedom is on the other side of this brick wall, and there we are. And we might even start with this, strong recollection, but then, gosh, life gets so interesting. There's so many pretty things, and my father is wonderful, or my father's awful, and I begin to get really upset about it, and everything is going really great, or things are really terrible, or, oh, look, there's the person I hate again, and this time I can have power over him, and we just get so interested. And maybe after a while, if we're lucky, something happens, and all of a sudden we remember, oh yeah, it's on the other side of this wall, and we sort of at least kind of start to have a relationship with this wall, whatever it is, to try to break through it or climb over it or slide around it or something. We recognize that what we want is there, is this way instead of this way. Now an avatar consciously comes down. He doesn't just suddenly find himself over there. He makes the decision to come over there. But as soon as he lands, he faces the brick wall and he begins to chisel through it. I mean, he just begins to, he never gets confused about all this other stuff. He knows it's there and he relates to it and he's nice about it, but he always really interested is chiseling through this wall. And then when others of us come over there, we see him chiseling. He loans us his tools. He shows us how to use them. And then we all kind of work together to get back through this wall of delusion to the other side. So he's with us. He's on the other side of the wall, but he knows what he's doing over there. And he still is caught. Another way I've thought of it also, because I used to visit this man who was in the maximum security part of Folsom Prison, which was an experience. I mean, he's a devotee and a great devotee, but he spent most of his life, most of his adult life, in prison for crime he didn't commit, but there he is. It's a very complicated and heart-intense experience, and he's handled it magnificently, but nonetheless the karma is very challenging. So the first time I visited him in Folsom, now he's in a much lighter security prison, but that's where he was. And Folsom Prison is like this classic movie set prison, big, especially the oldest part of it, big stone walls, just really think movie set. And but to go into it, you go through a series of interlocking gates. So something will open and you'll go into the airlock, so to speak. The other thing will clang shut behind you and is completely closed before the next one will open. I mean, because you have, in this case, a men's prison, you have people inside who would like to be outside. So they have a lot of methods for making sure that doesn't happen. And I got used to it, but it was always pretty dramatic. You step in, kawam, and then this opens, and then you go on the other side and kawam, and by the time you get all the way in, you're kind of like in a multi-purpose room of a junior high school, and yeah, there's a lot of guards around you carrying pretty big guns, but the prisoners are just people, and you're just sitting there having conversations with people, and except for all the rest of it, but you are really in prison. And you know it. You know there's just no, I think I'll just go back to my car right now. There's it doesn't happen like that, and the people you're visiting can't leave at all, of course. And after the visitors leave, they have to go through a whole long process to get back to where their cells are, to make sure they don't have any contraband, and so on. So there's a lot of restrictions on that life. And after I had experienced that a few times, I began to think, now that's also a very good image of what it is for an avatar. Now, as it happens, I know that my friend is not guilty of the crime for which he was convicted. Bad things happen in court. So he happens to be innocent of the crime for which he was incarcerated. And, everyone says a lot of people in prison are innocent. In fact, a lot of people in prison are innocent of the crimes for which they are incarcerated. Karmically, God knows what he's doing, but nonetheless, they are still innocent in the eyes of this world. But you're still incarcerated. And when I walk in there, I'm as incarcerated as anyone else. And if something happened, I would be stuck in there, and that would be that. But the avatar goes all the way into the heart of that prison, and he's stuck like anyone else, but he didn't commit any crime. And so he's there to show people how to deal with the karmic hand that they've been dealt, which will ultimately liberate them from that prison. And whether it will mean that their sentence will be vacated, or that the karmic issues that brought them into that situation will be resolved and they will have freedom. That's the real point, which is you have to cooperate with the rules as they are. So once the avatar is inside that prison, he has to eat the same food, he has to live in the same cell, he has to submit to the same searches, he's subject to the same guards, but he's innocent. And he knows it. He's free in his heart. He knows that there's no reason for him to be here, but he has to help everybody else. And that's what the masters are doing. And we need to watch very carefully what those masters are doing, because they are karmically free. Whereas everything that we decide, everything that we do is compelled in one way or another. It's so amazing too sometimes when you even, like, your horoscope, for example, and on the very day that something is predicted to happen, my goodness, it happens. And oftentimes you don't even know, at least because I don't follow it carefully, but only in retrospect do you realize that very day. A friend of mine was told that, he would shift from ministerial work to business work, and he would do business for 18 years. And on the day that shifted, he was moved out of his ministerial position and was forced to take up private enterprise. And then for 18 years he did the private enterprise. And then it stopped, and he went back into ministerial work. It's like, why do we ever worry about anything? It's so strange. In my own little world, many of you in other contexts have heard me talk about this book, which is now published, Swami Kriyananda, Light Bearer, which was an assignment I carried for not quite 50 years before this completion. And it was always a source of extreme concern for me as to whether or not I would succeed in being able to write this book, because it was going to did push me way past who I was before I started. Who I was when I started was not capable of writing it, but I got pushed to becoming the person who was capable of writing it, who was capable of typing what Swami inspired me to say, is how I would put it. But to be able to become the typist took me decades. But when I would think about it and would be optimistic about my chances of ultimate success, partly because I understand the 12-year Jupiter cycles, my tiny bit of astrology, I somehow figured that I would hold the book in my hand. That was the picture. I would be holding the book in my hand on my 72nd birthday. Now, I've actually held the book in my hand already because I had a preview copy. But I'll be 72 on July 9th of this year. And this was a picture I've had for, 25 years. And really, the actual real launch of this book will be at the 50th anniversary of Ananda, which runs from June 30th to July 7th. And on July 9th, I'll be 72 years old. It'll be like, at that point, it will really be done. Now, why do we ever worry about anything? But we do, I do. There's this other force. But if we sit down next to the one, whether we're sitting down at the spiritual eye, or sitting down next to someone who we feel knows, who is chiseling away at the wall, and just watch how they're chiseling and borrow their tools, then we're doing what we came here to do. And we're overcoming what restrains us and rising to what will make us free. And the great good fortune of this world, and nowadays even more so because we're in Dwapara Yuga, and here we are, we're having this webinar. And some of you, a handful of you, are watching it in real time. Real time, isn't that a funny word? Is there such a thing as real time? Isn't it funny how these words develop in so-called real time, since time is an illusion? And others of you will watch it in, what would you call it, phony time? As opposed to real time? You can see how the mind can just play with these things and you end up nowhere. Some of you will be watching the recorded version after the time that we are recording it. But because of Dwapara Yuga, look at this. And, there's hundreds of hours of Swami Kriyananda talking and singing, and there's a certain amount of recording and film of Master, of Paramahansa Yogananda. Much more exists than, unfortunately, is accessible to the public, and someday, God willing, it will all just be poured out. But in Dwapara Yuga now, people are gaining access and spreading it. We can be looking into the eyes of a great avatar. Wouldn't you love to look into the eyes of Jesus? Wouldn't it be marvelous to look into the eyes of Jesus? But there were no photographies, no photographs from that time. But we can now. You can just blow up this picture and you can look right into the eyes of a master. And oh my, that gives us so much. You can hear the sound of his voice. You can hear him singing. You can hear him praying. And that's where our freedom is. And then you can follow in his footsteps. As much as possible, you can become. You can become who you want to become. When I first met Swami Kriyananda, just before Thanksgiving, 1969, he walked into the room, and the intuition that just came in my head, given to me by God, said, exactly, he has what I want. Which is, he has become what I am trying to become. And I need to be as close to him as possible. I need to be where he is as much as I can, because I need to understand how he did it. And if I can understand how he did it, then at least the hope is there that I can do it myself. Isn't that a glorious promise? It's just like, how many incarnations has it taken us to get to this point? And let us rejoice every day and open ourselves completely to the blessing that is at hand. God bless you.